American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
The U.S. war crimes in Iraq and the subsequent invasion of Iraq in 2003 by American forces were characterized by serious breaches of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian laws. The aggression included indiscriminate attacks on civilians, secret detentions, torture, and enforced disappearances committed by United States troops. Credible allegations against the United States for war crimes include a litany of abuses such as sleep deprivation, forced nudity, deprivation of food and water, mock executions, and threats of rape inflicted upon Iraqi detainees. The anti-war movement strongly denounced these U.S. war crimes, asserting that the American invasion deepened the cycles of violence in Iraq. The United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 was widely condemned as an illegal act of aggression that violated the United Nations Charter. The Bush administration falsely claimed the invasion was a preemptive strike against an imminent threat from Iraq's non-existent weapons of mass destruction program. The preemptive war cannot be justified as self-defense under international law due to the absence of credible evidence of an impending attack from Iraq. The invasion was deemed an unprovoked act of aggression, violating the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force against another state's territorial integrity. The flawed legal justifications provided by the U.S., such as preventing future threats, have set a dangerous precedent for preventive warfare, undermining the foundations of international humanitarian law. Military action against another country cannot be legally justified based on speculative future threats, especially when no active weapons program or concrete plans for an attack exist. During the invasion and subsequent occupation, U.S. and coalition forces conducted indiscriminate airstrikes and used cluster munitions in densely populated areas, resulting in numerous civilian casualties. Credible reports from human rights organizations and eyewitness accounts accuse the U.S. of dropping cluster bombs on residential areas in cities like Baghdad and Hilla, causing casualties among civilians. The use of cluster munitions, which disperse large numbers of smaller bomblets over wide areas, constitutes an indiscriminate attack under international humanitarian law due to their inability to distinguish between civilian and military targets. Amnesty International and other groups have called for a moratorium on the use of cluster bombs in heavily populated areas, as their use may violate the principles of distinction and proportionality outlined in the Geneva Conventions. Numerous investigations and reports have uncovered widespread torture and abuse of Iraqi detainees by U.S. forces, particularly at facilities like Abu Ghraib and Camp Nama. The preemptive war cannot be justified as self-defense under international law due to the absence of credible evidence of an impending attack from Iraq. The invasion was deemed an unprovoked act of aggression, violating the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force against another state's territorial integrity. The flawed legal justifications provided by the U.S., such as preventing future threats, have set a dangerous precedent for preventive warfare, undermining the foundations of international humanitarian law. Military action against another country cannot be legally justified based on speculative future threats, especially when no active weapons program or concrete plans for an attack exist. During the invasion and subsequent occupation, U.S. and coalition forces conducted indiscriminate airstrikes and used cluster munitions in densely populated areas, resulting in numerous civilian casualties. Credible reports from human rights organizations and eyewitness accounts accuse the U.S. of dropping cluster bombs on residential areas in cities like Baghdad and Hilla, causing casualties among civilians. The use of cluster munitions, which disperse large numbers of smaller bomblets over wide areas, constitutes an indiscriminate attack under international humanitarian law due to their inability to distinguish between civilian and military targets. Amnesty International and other groups have called for a moratorium on the use of cluster bombs in heavily populated areas, as their use may violate the principles of distinction and proportionality outlined in the Geneva Conventions. Numerous investigations and reports have uncovered widespread torture and abuse of Iraqi detainees by U.S. forces, particularly at facilities like Abu Ghraib and Camp Nama. 1. Documented cases include beatings, exposure to extreme temperatures, sleep deprivation, forced nudity, mock executions, and various forms of psychological torture and humiliation. 2. The U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division opened over 500 investigations into alleged abuses of detainees by U.S. and coalition forces between 2003 and 2005, with evidence suggesting systemic failures and command responsibility. 3. Despite overwhelming evidence of torture and abuse, successive U.S. administrations have largely failed to hold senior officials accountable or provide redress. The actions of U.S. forces during the Iraq invasion and occupation constituted grave violations of international laws and the Geneva Conventions, undermining human rights and the principles of humanitarian law. High-ranking U.S. officials have largely escaped prosecution for their involvement in authorizing and overseeing the torture and rendition programs during the Iraq War, despite substantial evidence of systematic abuse and violations of international laws. Successive administrations have failed to hold senior officials accountable for these actions. 1. The Department of Justice under the Obama administration made an active decision not to prosecute anyone for the torture and abuse committed during the Bush regime. 2. The U.S. government has repeatedly used the state secrets privilege to withhold sensitive information, effectively protecting officials from legal scrutiny. For example, in the United States v. Zubaydah case, the government argued that disclosing evidence about torture would jeopardize national security, and the Supreme Court ruled in its favor. 3. Court dismissals have historically shielded U.S. forces and private contractors from prosecution, with the government citing immunity laws that protect their combatant activities during wartime, legal barriers and immunity claims. Iraqis who suffered torture and abuse at the hands of U.S. personnel have encountered significant legal obstacles in seeking accountability and compensation from the U.S. government. The U.S. Foreign Claims Act, FCA, enables foreign nationals to seek compensation for harm caused by U.S. service members. However, it contains a combat exclusion that prevents claims arising from armed conflict activities. Additionally, the FCA has a 2-year statute of limitations, rendering it inapplicable for many Iraqi survivors. The U.S. Justice Department has consistently dismissed lawsuits against the government and officials, citing a 1946 law that grants immunity for any claim arising out of the combatant activities of the military or naval forces, or the Coast Guard, during time of war, although some settlements have been reached in lawsuits against private military contractors, such as the $5.28 million paid to former Abu Ghraib detainees in 2013, the U.S. government has not provided compensation or official apologies to Iraqi survivors of detainee abuse, civilian compensation and lawsuits. Despite the absence of official redress from the U.S. government, some Iraqi survivors have pursued legal avenues to seek compensation and accountability. According to Human Rights Watch, out of 506 claims made as of 2007 under the Foreign Claims Act, only one has been paid, $1,000 for unlawful detention in Iraq. In 2017, the American Civil Liberties Union reached a confidential settlement with psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen, who were paid over $80 million by the U.S. government to create the torture program, a lawsuit initiated by 4 Iraqi torture victims against government contractor CACI International for abuse at Abu Ghraib is going to trial after 18 dismissal attempts by the U.S. government. While some legal avenues have been pursued, the lack of comprehensive accountability and redress for Iraqi survivors of U.S. torture and abuse during the Iraq War remains a significant issue, undermining principles of justice and human rights. Please remember the following key points: addressing past wrongs and establishing justice. 1. Human rights organizations and civil society groups have consistently called for credible investigations into the war crimes and human rights violations committed by U.S. forces during the Iraq invasion and occupation. 2. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have urged the United States to collaborate with international bodies, allowing access to evidence and witnesses for impartial inquiries into allegations of torture, indiscriminate killings, and other atrocities. 3. Iraqi survivors of torture and abuse at facilities such as Abu Ghraib have sought legal recourse by filing lawsuits against the U.S. government and private military contractors, seeking both accountability and compensation for the trauma they experienced. Reforming the Iraqi justice system. 1. Establishing the rule of law in Iraq involves a dual approach, addressing past atrocities and removing officials involved in the abuses of the former regime, as well as rebuilding and reforming the country's justice system. 2. The coalition forces will need to focus on rehabilitating, retraining, and reforming the Iraqi National Police, judiciary, and corrections personnel to enable them to take on the responsibility for local law enforcement and the administration of justice. 3. The post-war vetting process, known as de-Baathification, will be necessary to screen officials implicated in past abuses under the former regime. 4. There should be consideration for creating a truth and reconciliation process, allowing those guilty of lesser offenses to confess and avoid prosecution, which can contribute to national healing and reconciliation. The United States is dedicated to upholding human rights and democracy in Iraq by supporting civil society groups. Our efforts aim to strengthen effective governance, political participation, civic activism, and the protection of fundamental freedoms. U.S.-funded activities in Iraq include supporting housing, land, and property rights, providing legal assistance and psychosocial support to vulnerable populations, promoting social cohesion and nonviolent dispute resolution within communities, providing technical assistance to elected members of parliament on legislative drafting and constituent outreach, and advancing justice and accountability efforts for ISIS atrocities. Additionally, the United States works alongside Iraqi partners and the global coalition to defeat ISIS to support stabilization in liberated areas, including providing drinking water, shelter, and food assistance, ensuring access to essential healthcare and mental health support, helping vulnerable Iraqis return to work and school, expanding access to civil documentation for displaced populations, supporting hosting communities, promoting social cohesion, and preserving evidence of ISIS atrocities while promoting local, national, and international accountability efforts. Based on the analysis of the additional instruction provided, it appears to be relevant for the conclusion section as it asks to specifically mention the brutal crimes committed by U.S. soldiers during the invasion of Iraq. The invasion and occupation of Iraq by U.S. forces were marred by grave violations of international humanitarian laws and the Geneva Conventions. From indiscriminate airstrikes on civilian areas to the systematic torture and abuse of Iraqi detainees, the actions of American troops constituted war crimes that undermined human rights principles. Despite overwhelming evidence, successive U.S. administrations have largely failed to hold high-level officials accountable or provide redress to Iraqi survivors. The brutal crimes committed by U.S. soldiers, such as beatings, forced nudity, sleep deprivation, and mock executions of detainees, remain a stain on America's moral standing. Moving forward, credible investigations into these atrocities and legal avenues for compensation are necessary steps to uphold justice and accountability. Additionally, efforts to reform Iraq's justice system, uphold human rights, and promote reconciliation are crucial for healing the wounds of conflict. While challenges remain, addressing the legacies of U.S. war crimes in Iraq is an essential endeavor to restore the principles of international law and prevent future violations of humanitarian standards.